So I think one of the major causes of mental health issues that's kind of unexplored and people don't talk about enough is the idea that we have unrealistic expectations of people. In pretty much every respect, there's unrealistic expectations of your relationships to other people, your skill set, your income, what property you're supposed to own, etc. We have this set of expectations that I think is pretty much unprecedented in human history. For most of human history, people were struggling to just feed themselves, and if they could get basic education, learn a couple skills or something, and that was kind of viewed as an achievement above and beyond what was expected of you. But nowadays, to not be a loser, to not be a failure in society's eyes, you have to be an entrepreneur, you have to work like 50, 60 hours a week, you have to constantly be advancing in your career, you have to have an income of over $100,000, you have to own at least one house, preferably also a cottage and a summer home, or a rental property on top of that. You have to like have this perfect marriage, or you have to just be sleeping around with a lot of attractive women or something like that. I just think if you kind of start going through it and you look at all the things that are widely considered necessary, not to be like accomplished in society even, but just to be the bare minimum of being a pleb, not even being a patrician, but just being kind of what passes or what is idealized as kind of what the norm of society should be. It's very difficult, and I think it's something most people can't achieve. And there's a number of reasons for this, and so let's just kind of go into the reasons and kind of explore this idea a bit more. So something I've been very critical of on my channel is this kind of conservative, liberal, libertarian consensus that people are to a large extent interchangeable. That is, regardless of race, gender, innate ability, social situation, culture, etc., people have basically the same capacity in all regards. And this is kind of particularly when you get into conservatives, like within the American tradition, they'll often say if you're not wealthy, it's because you're lazy or because you are unwilling to apply yourself. Everybody can and should be an entrepreneur, and everybody can and should be rich. And I feel to a large extent that that's a big part of it. And this kind of idea is also echoed in its own way by the left, who take the perspective where if you're not rich and successful, it's because somebody else is stealing from you. And they're kind of two sides of the same coin. In one, it's you're supposed to kind of resent and blame somebody else for why you're not living up to what I consider unrealistic standards, and the other one, you're supposed to blame yourself. So it's kind of pick your poison. You want to become a bitter, resentful person, or do you want to become a depressive person who feels that they're worthless and a loser? And that's kind of, I think, to a large extent, the two aspects. They don't necessarily set the standard, but they give everybody this false impression that they can do anything. So even if you're born with, I don't know, an IQ of 90, you could still be a great scientist if you just work hard enough. Even if you have, I don't know, you're shy or you have an introverted personality, you can still be a great salesman if you just put in enough time. And I guess to a certain extent, if you force yourself to do something enough, you might get good at it, but some people are just not capable of getting good at certain things. And sometimes it's just not practical. It's just that's not their area of expertise. They'll never be good at it as someone who's more naturally inclined towards that area. So, yeah. But that's, I think, an aspect of it. The media is another aspect of it. The media and what I kind of call urban culture, a lot of people call it kind of the urban bubble. And this is because culture is largely dominated by TV shows and movies from urban areas. And not only urban areas, but like the wealthiest parts of the world, like where movie stars come from, like Toronto, where major banks are located, etc. They kind of view their lifestyle as being normal. the like upper middle class to upper class downtown kind of elite urban lifestyle is they view as kind of the normative standard that everyone should aspire to, and that is attainable by everybody. So like in their mind, because their rent's like $2,000 or $3,000 a month and everything else is so expensive, they kind of consider anything below 100K a year to be a sign of poverty. They consider not owning a fancy condo or a house or something to be a sign of extreme poverty. I don't know if people are kind of understanding, but it's if you watch any kind of movie or TV show, particularly I think the worst for this are the teenage sitcoms. I'm not too familiar with the specific ones, but they always portray like these upper middle class kids from like the suburbs or urban areas who go to like this amazing school. They can afford all these trips and clothes and drugs and stuff, and it's not reflective of the way the average person lives. Now I come from a fairly I wouldn't, I don't know, like a upper middle class background myself, and I kind of have experienced a lot of this firsthand. Like in my community, if you don't have a cottage, you're kind of viewed as an inferior person. You're poor, you're kind of a pleb. If you don't take an overseas vacation every year, you're poor and you're a pleb. And that's just kind of what the standard is, and this is reinforced through media. But the reality is most people can't do that. Nor do a lot of people necessarily want to do that. But rather than this kind of being accepted, they're told that they're losers. And that they're failures as a human being because they can't live up to what is a very new standard. Like this was just not something, maybe if you were upper class, like upper class, there was this idea that you go on kind of a road trip to find yourself. Like if you were a young aristocrat or something after you finished school. But that's kind of gone from that to become a norm. So if you don't like do a foreign exchange program or something like that, then you wasted your college years. And you kind of have, like I said, this portrayal of reality that only reflects urban or suburban, upper middle to upper class lifestyles. And even then, it's an idealized version of this. And it's not only portrayed in the media, but it's widely accepted as kind of being normative. So, and just... And this is given priority over, say, working hard, although conservatives idealize that, but in a different way. Like hard work or being financially stable is something that's not very valued at all in the modern era. So, like, for instance, if you make the decision that I don't really need to buy a lot of this kind of conspicuous consumption stuff, I might take an overseas vacation every couple of years, that's viewed as being like a pleb choice. That's viewed as you being a greedy or stingy person. And what you should be doing is you should be going into debt. As much debt as possible to fund this standard that's kind of being sold to you. And I know it's kind of a cliche that advertising makes people unhappy because it portrays the impossible lifestyle, but it's true. I mean, think about it. You aren't as good looking at these people. You don't have the lifestyle they do. Everything just doesn't magically work out. And I'm a lover of movies, but I think people will often mistake a movie for reality. They'll think it's realistic, that things just kind of work out in the end, that all the people in real life are good looking and intelligent and charming, and if they're not wealthy, like even just kind of the presumption, if you look at how they think average people look, they have the massive apartment, like the penthouse apartment downtown, and just all this other stuff that is just, like I said, not really reflective. And that kind of thing. And once again, it depends also on where you grow up. Like, if you grow up in an upper middle class suburb, the expectation might be that you get, like, because I was in the gifted program. I was in a program we have in Canada for people with high IQs, And I was probably in the middle of that in terms of my grades. I have a learning disability, which holds me back quite a bit. So getting like A minuses within that context still means you're in the top like 5% of people academically nationally. But because your relative position is against people with IQs over like 120, 130, and you don't do as well as them, or you're not in like the top half of that, or not even top half, but like top 25% of that, you feel like a loser. And you're not a loser. If you go in and you look at what kind of the average person's doing in school, you're far above that. But it's very relative to your position. And despite kind of this opening up of society, this unlimited amount of information, I think in a lot of cases, rather than giving people perspective, it kind of takes people's perspective away, because it shows them what it tends to show them is more of just these things that don't really happen. So, like, that's all. I think something, and it's a little hard to kind of explain it necessarily, but this is, I think, very, very important. Because I know for my part, it's like, okay, I'm only making, what, like 47, 50 grand a year, which is very good for someone in their mid-20s, I have money saved, etc. But kind of because of my background and because of the people around me, there's people I know who are like investment bankers, and they got in at, I don't know, some big company, and they're making like 250K a year plus their bonus and their other stuff. And you're just like, I can't do that, or I haven't achieved that, so that means I'm a loser. And you overlook the like 70-80% of people who are working, I don't know, minimum wage, or stuck in an endless stream of internships, or don't have health benefits, or have massive amounts of student debt. And you're comparing yourself to this group of people that is not reflective of anything. It's not reflective of any norm. It's not even really reflective, like I said, of the norm of where they're from, but it's very dependent on your social circle. And like I said, you could be doing well. And kind of another problem with this is the baby boomers. Because as I think it's been I've talked about this, a lot of people have talked about this, the norm for them, they lived through a much more economically prosperous time. They lived through a time in which jobs were a lot easier to come by. They were more stable. You had benefits. You had pensions. Like, people I know who are baby boomers, some of them have fantastical pensions, like inflation adjusted, 70-80% of their income. They'll probably be making effectively more money once they retire, because they don't have to pay a lot of the costs associated with working. And if they retire at 60, they can still, like, particularly with modern health, people are a lot healthier nowadays, so they can still do work, at least part-time, and they're pretty much set. They might have paid off their houses too. And that's just not the same thing. For like young people, jobs are increasingly extremely technical. Businesses don't hire people like permanently that often anymore. It's like an endless stream of contracts. The housing market is insane compared to where it used to be. So you're probably just not going to have the same standard of living that your parents did. And you try to compare your salary to them. You try to compare where you are in your career and how often you have to change jobs. And you're like, well, I'm barely scraping by. Whereas my parents lived a much more economically prosperous life. And once again, that's not necessarily, they aren't necessarily representative of what society is like. But what the baby boomers had and what your parents had just isn't the norm anymore. It's nowhere near the norm. If you look at like the average income, you're like, I'm way below average income. Keep in mind that that's not necessarily realistic. That includes a lot of people. Also keep in mind that the population growth has basically stopped without immigration, and the population's aging, and obviously older people make more money, so you have to kind of go and look at people within your age group if you want to really talk about it. But then you also have more stuff like professional needs. You have people who are in unpaid internships whose income may not even be put into the average. And you start kind of looking at it and you're like, maybe the situation's a lot worse. which is better from you because you're not really that badly off. You're not really that big a loser compared to the average person. And that's kind of in an economic sense. Let's talk about unrealistic standards in a social sense. Historically, lots of people haven't gotten married. Lots of people had trouble finding spouses and they remain single. This isn't like something particularly new or something that is just bizarre. Some people get married later in life. Some people, like I said, just choose not to get married at all. Some people don't have a billion relationships, screw a bunch of people during college, etc. So if you're just not having luck in that area, it's almost, and this is kind of where you get people like Elliot Rogers and kind of some of the incel and just stuff like that, where because they've kind of been sold those bill of goods from their parents, like all the swinger shit they did when they're young, from the TV shows, the amount of like sex and drugs and rock and roll you're supposed to get, they feel they're kind of owed this, that this is the norm, and if they aren't achieving this, they're a failure. And not just that, like I said, there's the kind of the conservative aspect that you're a failure because you're not working hard enough and because you can't live up to your potential. And then there's kind of the liberal perspective that you're a failure because somebody is screwing you. So when you kind of take these two and combine them together, you have this entitlement mentality, this kind of twisted entitlement mentality that if you're not achieving what is, in, like I said, unrealistic standards in terms of like your social life, etc., then you're made to feel guilty about it. Like university, it's and this is like kind of these kind of memes that the mainstream comes up with, I think are very toxic and very harmful. This whole, the university is the best time of your life and it's all downhill from there. Like what is that about? Why would you say that to somebody? Maybe the person had a hard time. Maybe they spent their time studying. Like I've talked to a lot of people like, oh, I wish I hadn't studied so much in university and I'd have had fun. Well, it's your decision. I mean, maybe that has more value to you. Maybe you went to a bad university. Maybe things just didn't work out. That's just kind of how life is. And things don't work out a lot of the time. And that's a good thing, because if things always worked out and you had a bad time, then that would mean it really was your fault. But like, stuff happens. Maybe you couldn't afford to go to an expensive university. Maybe you had a bad circle of friends. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff involved with it. Lots of people have the best time of their lives later in life. It's to me, the understanding of that is not even like meaningful, what the best time of your life is. Because every point in your life is going to have positives and negatives. You might be wealthier but have less time to yourself. You might be poorer but spend more time with your friends. Like, everything's kind of give and take. And to kind of say, oh, this is supposed to be the best time of your life, high school or college or whatever, and you're never going to have fun again. It's just kind of like that's just kind of a recipe for just making people either feel guilty that they're not having more fun or feel bad in the aftermath. And you just get this a lot for all kinds of stuff. And like, it used to be in society, getting old was viewed as, in a lot of ways, a positive thing, because you gained social status, you were this wizened elder, your kids would take care of you, etc., and you were viewed as kind of wise. And now it's kind of frowned upon, and getting old is viewed as the worst thing possible, that there's nothing kind of good or admirable about it. And like, there's just a lot of other things. Like, a lot of women traditionally have been completely fulfilled by staying home and raising their kids, and now they're told if they do that and they don't have like a full career and they're a doctor or whatever, they're not a real woman, they're a loser, they're whatever. So I think, to my mind, probably the ways of dealing with this is you have to try to take a step back and you have to try to look at reality. You have to say, okay, what is my current situation? Where am I in within the context of greater society? Do I live within this area of people who are representative or not? And maybe you live in like rural or like a small city in the South or something, and the people, you know, a lot of them are blue collar and they aren't particularly wealthy, and it does reflect real life. And then you kind of go, well, what am I like compared to these people? But maybe you've like moved from a small town to the city to get work, which a lot of people have. And the people you're competing with and the people you're going with are like the top 10% of society in terms of IQ and ability and skills and that kind of thing. And comparing yourself to them is an effort in futility because you're always going to come up short. So, like I said, I think these are just important things to keep in mind. Also, just look at the people you know. Are the people, a lot of the people you know are probably a lot worse than you in at least some respects. Success isn't this like uniform thing across the board. You say, oh, this person's successful. Lots of successful people I know financially are horrible human beings. Or they have just disastrous personal lives where they've gone through messy divorces, they've been abandoned by their families, etc. Or maybe they have a very fulfilling family life, but their career is a complete disaster. These things aren't uniform. There isn't just like a successful person. You're successful in some areas and less successful in others. But we're kind of, like I said, presented with this image of someone like everybody's a Renaissance man. Everybody's good at everything. Everybody knows everything. And I think there has to be kind of a change in society's attitude where we accept it's okay to have some flaws. It's okay to mess up sometimes. It's okay if you don't achieve the best thing. You do what you can and you try to kind of be the person that you're kind of designed to be. You kind of try to just be, I know be true to yourself and that kind of thing is a cliche, but you can only really do what you can do in terms of your skill, in terms of your effort. Like a lot of life is just outside of your control. What your background is beyond your control. Where you grow up, the schools you go to, a lot of this stuff is just kind of happenstance or is kind of predetermined, just logically speaking, by who your parents are, etc. And I think you just have to accept to a certain extent that a lot of life is beyond your control. And I think the sooner you accept that and you accept that most of the things that happen to you aren't really your fault, that you can just try to do what you try to do, but that you're competing with the will, like your will is competing with the will of 6 billion other people, plus nature, plus God, plus just all this other stuff. And it's just kind of a drop in the ocean. That's not to say you shouldn't try hard, and that's not to say that you can't achieve things, but you just don't, you have to learn to not put 100% of your failures on yourself and your lack of effort and feel guilty about it. And I know this is one of the hardest things to do, and I know it's people are going to say this is pretty much impossible, but just take a minute and think, reflect on what I said, and hopefully this has helped you a bit, or you understand your situation a bit better. So I hope the video helped you, and I'll talk to you guys later.